September 8, 1945. The sky over Tokyo hung heavy with silence, a silence that felt louder than any bomb. The war had ended 3 weeks ago, yet the city still smelled of ash and fear. In a small apartment near Shibuya, a woman named Sachiko knelt beside a cracked basin, washing her younger sister's face with water she had carried from 3 blocks away. She was 21 and hollow from hunger, her hands steady despite the trembling that had lived in her bones since the firebombing. Outside, the first American jeeps rolled down streets that had once echoed with victory marches, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. She had been told all her life that Americans were devils, that they would burn children alive, that they showed no mercy. Yet, as she peered through the window's broken frame, she saw a soldier, no older than her brother who died at Guadalcanal, tossing a chocolate bar to a group of barefoot children. The children scattered at first, then slowly crept back, drawn by curiosity stronger than fear. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Across Tokyo and Yokohama, the same scene unfolded again and again. Tanks parked beside temples without roofs, jazz music drifting from radios in the same streets where air raid sirens had screamed only months before. Japan was a nation stripped of everything but memory. The emperor's voice had crackled through radios on August 15th, the first time most had ever heard him speak, telling them to endure the unendurable. The military broadcasts had fallen silent, and with them the constant rhythm of certainty. Rumors replaced orders now, whispered warnings that the Americans were coming, and they would make Japan pay for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, for every island soaked in blood. But the first days brought not executions, but rations, not cruelty, but caution. Some GIs asked shopkeepers for directions using hand gestures and broken Japanese. Others traded cigarettes for fans painted with cherry blossoms, souvenirs of a country they had been trained to hate. In the displaced persons camp outside Yokohama, rows of women lined up for rice under a tattered American flag. Their faces were sharp with hunger and disbelief. Beside them, a young US corporal distributed cans of Spam, smiling awkwardly as the women bowed deeply, murmuring thanks in a language he didn't understand. His name was Private Daniel Morrison, 22, from Iowa, a farm boy who had never seen an ocean until he crossed one to fight. He looked into the faces of the defeated and saw not monsters, but echoes of his own mother back home, worn thin by years of worry. Sachiko was among those who came forward that day, clutching her ration card like a prayer. She avoided his eyes, but when he spoke soft, slow, and without anger, something in her steadied. The air carried a strange quiet that autumn. It was the silence of people who had survived everything except hope. In small neighborhoods, Japanese women emerged from shelters, wearing patched dresses and faces drawn thin as rice paper. They stared at the tall, confident soldiers who carried soap in one hand and rifles in the other. The Americans joked with each other, played baseball in bombed-out lots, offered gum to children, acts that seemed almost indecent against the backdrop of ruin. Every gesture was a contradiction. How could men who had firebombed cities still smile like that? For months they watched each other across invisible lines. The Americans were under orders not to fraternize. The Japanese were under orders to survive. But orders have a way of fading when hunger and loneliness begin to speak louder. One evening, as rain swept across the shattered windows of a Tokyo apartment, an American knocked at Sachiko's door. He wasn't searching for weapons or war criminals. He only wanted to know if there was a place nearby where he could buy food. She hesitated, remembering every poster that had warned her, the grotesque caricatures, the monstrous faces. Yet his eyes were tired and his uniform damp. She pointed down the street to where an old woman sold sweet potatoes from a cart. He bowed slightly, awkwardly, and thanked her. The next day he returned with a can of coffee and 2 cups. She had not tasted coffee since before the war began. They sat in the doorway, unable to speak a common language, but somehow understanding more than words could manage. Outside, the sound of construction had replaced the sound of sirens. For a moment she forgot who was the victor and who was the defeated. He handed her a small photograph of his family's farm, endless fields of corn under a sky too blue to be real. She stared at it as though it were a window into another world. Elsewhere, other women felt the same uneasy shift. In Osaka, one accepted a job at an American base to feed her family. In Kyoto, another learned to make hamburgers for soldiers who missed home. Kindness spread quietly, disguised as necessity. Yet with it came whispers from neighbors, from the occupying officers, from the ghost of the empire that still lingered in their minds. Was this forgiveness or betrayal? Could a heart trained for sacrifice relearn tenderness so quickly? The Americans were equally uncertain. Many had lost brothers in the Pacific, had seen friends die on beaches with Japanese names they couldn't pronounce, and now they found themselves offering aid to the same people they had been told were beyond redemption. They were surprised to find not fanatics, but weary mothers, hungry children, and girls who flinched at every loud sound. The enemy, it seemed, was human after all. Letters home began to change in tone. Less about victory, more about confusion. "They look like us when they cry," one GI wrote to his sister. "They just lost everything." By late autumn, the rubble began to bloom with makeshift markets. Civilians rebuilt stalls among the ruins, and laughter began to return in fragments. The Americans, still forbidden to socialize, found reasons to linger near the downsos, our neighborhoods. They handed out canned peaches, taught children to throw baseballs, repaired roofs when no one was looking. Sachiko worked at a small mess hall kitchen, washing dishes for both Japanese civilians and the Allied men who ate nearby. Daniel came there often, trading his army rations for conversations. He couldn't understand her words, but wanted to hear them anyway. Their exchanges were clumsy, but their eyes learned each other's grammar. She once asked through gestures why he wasn't angry, why he didn't hate her for what her country had done. He shrugged, then said slowly, speaking more to himself than to her, "The war's over." She didn't know the words, but she understood the weight. It was the first time she believed peace might mean something more than surrender. As winter settled, the first rumors began. Stories of American soldiers planning to marry Japanese women. It seemed impossible, almost obscene. Marry the enemy. Yet somewhere in Yokohama, a GI submitted paperwork requesting permission to wed a girl from Kobe. Somewhere else, a young woman received a letter with 3 words written in careful English. "Will you wait?" Sachiko carried her ration card and her doubt through another cold morning, unsure of what the world was becoming. The ruins still smoked in places, but from them came the faint smell of grilled fish. Across the camp, Daniel lifted his hand in greeting before climbing into his truck. She raised hers back, a shy, uncertain motion that felt heavier than any wartime salute. The year was 1945, and Japan had fallen. Yet among its ruins, something unexplainable was standing up again. Not flags, not empires, but people. The war had ended with silence. But in that silence, 2 enemies had begun to speak. What they didn't yet know was that the words they were learning, coffee, home, tomorrow, would soon change the meaning of victory itself. In the months that followed, Japan became a landscape of strange contrasts, a place where defeat and gentleness shared the same street. American trucks rumbled through Tokyo, still smelling of diesel and ocean salt. Their drivers tossed candy to children who no longer knew what abundance looked like. For women like Sachiko, survival had meant obedience, endurance, and sacrifice. But the silence was breaking now, replaced by the hum of generators, the crackle of armed forces radio, and the foreign rhythm of swing music leaking through windows patched with newspaper. She worked at the mess hall each morning, washing dishes beside crates stamped with white stars, while the men in khaki lined up for their meals, half soldiers, half boys, far from home. Private Daniel Morrison returned every day, his boots dusty, his grin easy as though he had never learned what hatred was supposed to look like. He carried small offerings, a bar of soap one day, a pair of worn socks another, once even a precious tin of condensed milk wrapped carefully in paper. "For you," he'd say in broken Japanese, then gesture that she must hide it before anyone saw. Fraternization, after all, was forbidden by regulation. But kindness, unlike ammunition, traveled quietly. Each gesture was a crime of compassion. General MacArthur's directives had made it clear. No American soldier was to associate unnecessarily with the Japanese population. But soldiers are not made of orders alone. They were made of curiosity, loneliness, and an aching need to feel human again after years of horror. Sachiko's eyes, cautious yet alive, became an anchor in the chaos of occupation. He had stormed beaches and watched friends die in jungles, yet somehow this quiet woman washing dishes in the ruins frightened him more. Every word between them risked punishment. Yet each day he returned, sometimes to help her lift the heavy pots, sometimes only to listen to her hum an old song that made him forget the sound of artillery. Rumors spread quickly through the neighborhoods. A Japanese woman had been caught accepting nylons from a sergeant. Another was accused of improper conduct for smiling too long at a corporal. Sachiko kept her distance in public, but the boundary between survival and longing blurred with each passing day. One night, when rain began to pour through the gaps in the mess hall roof, Daniel helped her pull tarps over the supplies. His sleeve brushed her hand, a small touch, yet it felt like lightning in a world soaked in ash. They stood in silence, breath visible in the cold, until she whispered in Japanese, "You should go." He nodded but didn't move. Across occupied Japan, similar stories unfolded quietly behind sliding doors and in shadowed alleyways. Cafes reopened under military supervision. Yet the Americans were the ones slipping extra sugar to Japanese waitresses. The women called them chocoretto, chocolate soldiers, half mocking, half yearning. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The conquerors with their abundance, the conquered with their hunger. But the exchange was never only about food or favors. It was about remembering what gentleness felt like after years of fire. Sachiko's friend Yuki, a widow whose husband had died at Iwo Jima, warned her to stay away. "They'll leave when the orders come," she whispered, "and you'll be the one left behind with shame and nothing else." Shame was a familiar companion. It had lived in every Japanese household since surrender. Yet this time Sachiko felt a quiet defiance stirring beneath it. When she met Daniel again, she told him through gestures and fragments of English that she used to dream of America as a girl, the land of movies and skyscrapers and freedom. He laughed softly, pulled a magazine from his jacket, and pointed to an advertisement showing a woman in a kitchen with appliances she had never seen. "That's not all real," he said, "but some of it is." The days grew longer. The Americans built new barracks. The Japanese rebuilt their walls and their lives. At night, distant music floated from the soldiers' recreation of halls. Songs from Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and Count Basie. The rhythms reached through the cold, and sometimes the Japanese women listened from the dark, swaying silently to a music they didn't understand but somehow felt. One evening, Daniel appeared near the mess hall carrying a small portable radio. He placed it on the counter, tuned it until the static softened, and let a song drift between them. She laughed, the first time he had heard her laugh, and for a moment the ruins outside seemed almost beautiful. Still, danger hovered. An American lieutenant spotted them speaking one afternoon and ordered Daniel to report to headquarters. That night, Sachiko waited in her small room, staring at the empty street below, wondering if mercy had limits after all. When he returned, 2 days later, bruised pride in his eyes, he said only, "They gave me a warning." She asked, "Will you stop coming?" He shook his head. No. That was the closest either came to a confession. Elsewhere, stories like theirs multiplied. By late 1946, fraternization bans were softening under pressure from reality. Commanders realized that hearts could not be rationed. In Kobe, a soldier married the daughter of a former naval officer. In Nagoya, a nurse wed a GI she had met while translating at a hospital. Newspapers back home printed the headlines with a mix of fascination and unease. Americans taking Japanese brides. Letters poured into editors, some outraged, others moved. One veteran wrote, "I didn't fight so we could teach people to hate forever." Sachiko and Daniel found small ways to keep their secret alive. He taught her words: coffee, friend, tomorrow. She taught him peace, hope, thank you, tracing the letters in dust on the counter. When he offered her a pair of nylon stockings, she hesitated, remembering Yuki's warnings. But the gift wasn't about vanity, it was about dignity. In a world where everything was taken, something soft and new against her skin felt like permission to be human again. One evening, as cherry blossoms began to fall early, Daniel told her he would soon be transferred to Okinawa. The words fell between them like shattered glass. She nodded, trying to appear indifferent, but her throat burned. "Maybe I write," he said, fumbling for his notebook. She smiled faintly. "If letters can cross oceans," she replied in halting English, "maybe hearts can too." Neither believed in such things, yet both wanted to. The night before his departure, he came to the mess hall one last time. The fires had gone out, and the room smelled of rain and metal. He handed her a paper-wrapped parcel. Inside was a photograph of him standing in front of an Iowa farmhouse, snow covering the fields, his dog beside him. On the back he had written, "For when you forget what kindness looks like." She looked at it for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and offered him a small origami crane, the only thing she had made since before the war. Their fingers touched as he took it, and neither spoke. At dawn, his convoy rolled out of Tokyo. She stood by the window, the photograph clutched to her chest as the trucks vanished into morning mist. Around her, Japan stirred awake again, its people carrying buckets of water, bundles of firewood, and fragments of memory. The war was over, yet its aftershocks still trembled through every human connection. Somewhere on the road south, Daniel looked back once, though there was nothing left to see. The first rumors of war brides began that same autumn. Whispers of women boarding ships, of vows exchanged under foreign laws. For Sachiko, it was only a story, a dream too fragile to name. Yet deep down she knew that love, once awakened, had a will of its own. The Americans had come as conquerors. Now, without meaning to, they had begun something far more dangerous: the rebuilding of hearts. By 1947, the war had been over for 2 years. Yet the world was still learning what peace meant. The ruins of Japan, no longer smoked, but they still whispered. In that fragile quiet, letters began to travel across the Pacific, brown envelopes with foreign stamps and words that smelled faintly of hope and distance. Some were written by American soldiers who couldn't forget the women they'd met among the rubble. Others by Japanese women who dared to believe that kindness had been real. Sachiko wrote hers carefully, each word a risk. "The cherry blossoms came again this year," she began. "But they fall faster now, as if they know something we don't." Weeks later, the postman handed her a reply, and for a moment she felt the impossible, the war's distance shrinking into something human. Daniel's letter was simple. He wrote that he had been transferred back to the States, working on his family's farm in Iowa, and that he thought often of her hands covered in soap at the mess hall, of her voice humming while she worked. "If there's any justice in this world," he wrote, "it brought us together for a reason." It was the kind of sentence that would have been mocked in peacetime, but after years of horror, sincerity had become its own rebellion. They exchanged letters through the military postal service, their words slipping past censors who never cared for stories of tenderness. Rumors spread that the United States might allow soldiers to marry foreign women. The news felt absurd, like another miracle made of paper. Still, in December 1945, Congress passed the War Brides Act, allowing American servicemen to bring their foreign wives home. It was amended in 1947 to include Japanese women, the former enemy, now astonishingly potential wives. In the newspapers, it was a bureaucratic footnote. In the camps and cities of occupied Japan, it was the sound of hearts unlocking. For Sachiko, it began with a question written in trembling ink. "Would you come to America?" She read it under a dim lamp, the world outside wrapped in winter. To leave meant safety, but also exile. To marry meant stepping into a life she could neither imagine nor explain. She had lost her father, her home, her nation's honor. Yet the idea of belonging to someone who saw her not as Japanese but as human, that was something worth risking. When she finally wrote back yes, she wasn't sure if it was love or survival. The paperwork was merciless. Dozens of forms, interrogations, background checks. Every bride to be had to prove she wasn't a communist sympathizer, wasn't diseased, wasn't lying about her identity. American officials inspected them with the same precision they once used for enemy combatants. They checked for tuberculosis, venereal disease, any trace of radical politics. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese police had to verify family records going back generations. The process could take a year or more. Yet, beneath the cold bureaucracy, the human story refused to disappear. Daniel filed request after request, even when neighbors questioned his judgment. "You want to marry a Jap," one man at the feed store said, the slur casual as breathing. "You sure you remember Pearl Harbor?" But he did remember. Every bombed ship, every friend who never came home, and that was precisely why he wanted something new to begin. By the spring of 1952, the first ships began carrying Japanese war brides to America. They called it Operation Diaper Run at first, though many of the women insisted it sounded more like a military evacuation than a wedding. Sachiko prepared to board one in Yokohama, clutching a single suitcase and Daniel's photograph. Around her, hundreds of women whispered prayers or cried softly, their voices mingling with the sound of ship horns. Some carried babies fathered by soldiers already waiting on the other side. Others carried nothing but faith in men who had once occupied their towns. Before they could leave, the American Red Cross offered something unexpected. Bride schools. Short courses, 3 to 6 weeks, designed to teach Japanese women how to be American housewives. Sachiko attended classes in a repurposed military building, sitting at desks beside women from Osaka, Kyoto, Hiroshima. They learned to make meatloaf and apple pie. They learned to say, "Please pass the salt," and "I'm so glad to meet you." They learned that American husbands expected dinner at 6 o'clock and that washing machines were not just for the wealthy. The instructors, mostly Red Cross volunteers, spoke slowly and demonstrated everything twice. They showed the women how to hold a fork properly, how to set a table with multiple plates, how to smile even when exhausted. One teacher held up a can opener and said, "This will be your best friend in America." The women laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. Sachiko practiced making Jello salad, a dish so strange it seemed like a test of faith. She burned her first batch of biscuits and oversalted her first pot roast. But she learned. They all learned, because going to America unprepared felt more dangerous than any bombing raid. When the ship finally left port, they watched the Japanese coastline fade, a land of ancestors disappearing beneath the mist. Days at sea blurred together. The women shared stories in broken English and laughter that felt too loud for a ship carrying so many secrets. Sachiko befriended a young woman named Keiko, who had married a mechanic from Texas. Keiko said she'd heard that in America even poor people had cars and that grocery stores had entire aisles just for cereal. "They say there's no rationing there," she whispered one night. Can you imagine? Sachiko couldn't. She dreamt of Iowa instead, of endless cornfields and quiet mornings free of air raid memories. The journey took 2 weeks. Some women were seasick the entire time. Others stood on deck every morning, watching the sun rise over an ocean that no longer carried warships. They sang songs to pass the time, mixing Japanese folk melodies with American tunes they'd learned from the radio. When the ship neared San Francisco Harbor, the air changed, clean, electric, full of promise. The women crowded the deck as the Golden Gate Bridge came into view, its cables shimmering through morning fog. For many, it was their first sight of America. For some, it was their first sight of possibility. Sachiko gripped the railing and wept quietly. She had expected to feel shame or fear. Instead, she felt disbelief. On the docks below, soldiers waited in pressed uniforms, holding flowers instead of rifles. Some were nervous, others grinning like schoolboys. Daniel stood among them, scanning every face as women disembarked. When he finally saw Sachiko, pale from the voyage, her coat buttoned to her throat, he froze. The noise of the port faded until there was only her walking down the gangway with trembling hands. He stepped forward, unsure of the right gesture, then simply held out his arm. She slipped hers through it. No words were needed. That afternoon they were married in a small chapel near the harbour, surrounded by a handful of other couples who had made the same improbable journey. The chaplain, weary from officiating dozens of weddings that month, smiled faintly as he said the vows. "You may kiss the bride," he added, almost as an afterthought. For Sachiko, the moment felt unreal, not because of the kiss, but because no one was afraid anymore. Their first home was a rented room above a bakery in San Francisco. The city overwhelmed her. Neon signs that never turned off, streetcars clanging up hills, shop windows filled with abundance she could barely comprehend. The first time she saw a supermarket, she stood frozen in the entrance, staring at shelves stacked 20 feet high with food. Daniel gently took her hand and led her inside. She cried in the cereal aisle, not from joy, but from the weight of understanding how much Japan had lost. Neighbors were curious but cautious. Some whispered behind curtains. Others brought casseroles as peace offerings. The war was fresh in everyone's memory, yet mercy proved contagious. An elderly woman next door, Mrs. Chen, who had fled China during the Japanese invasion, brought her dumplings anyway. "We survived the same war," she said simply, "just from different sides." Letters from Japan told her that not all stories ended so kindly. Some brides were rejected by in-laws who could not forgive Pearl Harbor. Others faced suspicion from both sides, traitors to one country, reminders of guilt to another. There were stories of Japanese women denied service at restaurants, refused apartments, stared at in grocery stores. Interracial marriage was still illegal in many states. Some couples had to cross state lines just to say their vows, but for every tragedy, there were 100 small mercies. Children born with English first names and Japanese middle names. Christmas trees lit in homes that once feared B-29s. America had absorbed its former enemy, not with punishment, but with possibility and prejudice in equal measure. One evening, as she learned to bake bread in their tiny kitchen, Daniel came home early, carrying a newspaper. "They're writing about you girls," he said, not unkindly. "War brides change America." She read the article slowly, her English still uncertain. It called them ambassadors of peace, symbols of reconciliation, proof that love could cross even the widest divide. But it also called them challenges and concerns and questions about assimilation. She looked at Daniel and asked, "Do they still hate us?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Some do," he said, "but they're learning not to." She leaned her head against his shoulder, thinking of the ruins she'd left behind, of the faces that would never understand her choice. In that moment, she realized that the greatest shock of all wasn't survival, it was forgiveness. The same nation that had dropped atomic bombs on her homeland had opened its doors to her, however reluctantly. History had demanded vengeance, but love, stubborn and quiet, had chosen differently. The ships had carried more than brides. They had carried proof that mercy could travel farther than hate. And yet, even as she slept that night, a faint unease lingered, a whisper of belonging and exile woven together. Tomorrow she would wake in America, where the streets were whole and the people smiled easily. But a part of her would always stand at that harbour, halfway between the rubble and the dream, waiting to see if kindness could last longer than memory. By 1955, America had moved on from the war. But the war had not moved on from those who lived through it. The men who had fought returned to their offices and factories. The women who had survived its fire tried to forget the sound of sirens by learning new words, new recipes, new dreams. In neighborhoods across the country, behind white picket fences and television antennas, a quiet revolution was taking place. Japanese accents mingling with American English. The newspapers no longer called them enemy wives. They were simply neighbors, mothers, citizens. Yet in kitchens like Sachiko's, beneath the calm of ordinary life, the past still flickered like an ember that refused to die. Their San Francisco apartment had given way to a small house in Iowa, near Daniel's family farm. The soil there was dark and generous, and the horizon stretched farther than she had ever seen. It was a land without ruins, without sirens, a silence so vast it frightened her at first. The town was polite, if uncertain. People smiled, but sometimes with too much effort. Children whispered when she spoke. The grocer once said, "You speak real good English for a Jap." Sachiko smiled and thanked him the way she had learned to during the occupation. Peace had its own rules of survival. Daniel worked long days, planting corn and soybeans. In the evenings they sat on the porch watching fireflies drift over the fields. Sometimes he spoke of the war, but mostly he didn't. The nightmares had faded, replaced by the small sounds of domestic life, her humming in the kitchen, the creak of the floorboards, the cries of their newborn daughter Emma. When the baby came, the town's curiosity softened. Gifts arrived, blankets, casseroles, a tiny American flag. Forgiveness, it seemed, could wear an apron. Still, not all doors opened. When the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall organized a memorial service, one old man refused to shake her hand. "My son died at Okinawa," he said, eyes clouded with pain that would never heal. She wanted to tell him she had lost her father to American bombs. That grief had no borders, no flags. But the words stuck in her throat. Later, Daniel found her crying in the garden. "He doesn't know you," he said gently. She nodded. "No," she whispered, "but he knows enough." Over time, the rhythm of American life carried her along. She learned to bake pies instead of mochi, to say hi there instead of good afternoon, to wave at neighbors instead of bow. She learned that Americans brought casseroles when you were sick, and gossip when you were not. She learned that children asked questions without malice. When Emma started school, she came home one day holding a crayon drawing of 2 flags. The stars and stripes on one side and on the other a red circle, she said, was Mummy's old one. Sachiko laughed through tears. The child had drawn a truce before the world had finished arguing. Letters from Japan arrived less often now. Keiko wrote once describing how Tokyo was rebuilding under American aid. "They say the occupation is over," she wrote, "but the Americans never really left. Some stayed because they married us." Sachiko read the letter aloud to Daniel, who smiled faintly. "Guess we both got something out of it," he said. "You got peace, I got you." In 1956, she stood before a federal clerk and swore allegiance to the United States. Her voice trembled as she renounced the land of her birth. Yet when she finished, she felt something she hadn't in years, belonging. Outside the courthouse, Daniel held her hand. "You're one of us now," he said. She looked at him and replied softly in English that no longer stumbled. "I always was." That night, they celebrated with a dinner of fried chicken and mashed potatoes, but she added a small dish of rice with pickled plum, a taste of home smuggled quietly into her new life. Historians would later write that more than 45,000 Japanese war brides became American citizens in those years. To the world, it was a statistic. To the women themselves, it was an act of resurrection. They built lives from contradictions, blending the nation that lost with the one that won, teaching their children that identity could be softer than politics, kinder than memory. Sachiko's house filled with small symbols of that blending. A ceramic cat from Kyoto sat beside a photograph of Daniel in uniform. Cherry blossom prints hung above Emma's crib next to Iowa State pennants. When neighbors asked where she was from, she would answer simply, "From before." It was the only place that felt safe to claim. The years passed quietly. Emma grew into a curious girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. She asked questions that neither parent could answer easily. "Was Japan bad, Mommy? Did Daddy fight against you?" Sachiko told her the truth in fragments. That people are sometimes swept into storms they never started, and that love, when it comes, doesn't ask for permission from history. On summer nights, when the air smelled of hay and rain, Daniel still called her the bravest woman I know. She would smile and say, "No, just the hungriest." They both knew what she meant. Not hunger for food, but for mercy. But history is never finished. In 1958, a documentary film crew came through Iowa to interview veterans about the war's aftermath. When they asked Daniel if they could film his family, he hesitated. "You sure?" She teased in English that no longer betrayed her origins. "Afraid. They'll find out you married the enemy." He grinned. "I married the future." During the interview, the reporter asked Sachiko what she thought of America now. She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had learned to translate not just language but entire worlds. "It is strange," she said slowly. "I came here as the enemy, but everyone I meet teaches me that forgiveness is more powerful than memory." The cameraman lowered his head, perhaps moved by how quietly truth could sound. When the program aired months later, neighbors stopped her on the street. One woman who had once avoided her at church brought her a jar of preserves. "You remind me why we won," she said. That night, Sachiko cried again, but the tears were different this time. Decades later, she would look back and see the pattern. How mercy, like a seed, had taken root where fire once burned. Across the country, the same story repeated in different accents and different towns. Thousands of women like her, planting gardens, baking bread, raising children who never learned to divide the world into us and them. The past didn't vanish, but it softened, folded gently into the rhythms of ordinary life. One autumn afternoon, after years of quiet work and laughter, Sachiko stood at the edge of her garden, watching Emma chase butterflies through the corn. Daniel sat nearby, older now, his hands weathered but steady. The sky blazed with the gold of harvest, and for a fleeting moment she felt the whole weight of her journey. From rubble to farmhouse, from enemy to wife, from fear to family. She turned to him and said softly, "It was all a kind of mercy, wasn't it?" He nodded. "The best kind," he said. "The kind nobody earned." The wind carried the scent of earth and apples, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rang. Not for victory or surrender, but for evening. As the sound faded, Sachiko whispered a prayer in Japanese, the first time she had spoken her language aloud in months. It wasn't a prayer to forget the war, but to remember how it ended. For some, the peace came from treaties and bombs. For others, it came from something smaller. A can of coffee shared between strangers, a letter written across an ocean, a child born to two former enemies who learned to call the same sky home. The war had taught the world how to destroy with precision and terrible efficiency. But love, quiet, stubborn, unmilitary love, had taught it how to rebuild. The Pacific Ocean that had once carried invasion fleets now carried letters between families who spoke two languages at dinner. The hands that had once built weapons now built cradles. The hearts that had been trained to hate now chose, slowly and imperfectly, to heal. Sachiko looked at the corn swaying in the evening breeze and thought of the rice paddies she would never see again. Both fed the hungry, both bent in the wind, both survived by putting roots in difficult soil. She had crossed an ocean not knowing if she would drown or fly. She had married a man whose country had destroyed hers, and somehow they had built something that neither nation could claim or destroy. It wasn't perfect. Emma would grow up answering questions about why her mother looked different. Sachiko would always feel the gap between who she was and who she had become. Daniel would carry the weight of islands whose names he couldn't forget. But they had made something new from the broken pieces, and that, perhaps, was the truest victory of all. As the sun set over Iowa, casting long shadows across the fields, Sachiko returned to the house. Inside, the radio was playing an American song she had learned to love. Outside, the world continued its slow work of forgetting and forgiving. And somewhere in between, 45,000 women like her lived lives that history books would barely mention. They were the war brides, the bridge builders, the ones who proved that the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple decision to see the enemy's face and recognize it as human. The war had ended in 1945 with surrender documents and atomic clouds. But it truly ended in kitchens and gardens, in children's laughter, and in the quiet moments when a woman from Tokyo and a man from Iowa realized they spoke the same language after all. Not English or Japanese, but something older and simpler. The language of two people who chose mercy over memory, who chose tomorrow over yesterday, who chose love over everything the war had tried to teach them about hate. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.